There is a silent moment that always happens before everything falls apart. It's that moment suspended in time when you're about to take an important step, embrace an opportunity, build something meaningful. And then, out of nowhere, something inside starts whispering, an almost imperceptible voice that plants a doubt, a hesitation, a fear. And without understanding why, your feet stop moving, your hands stop acting, your heart stops believing. It is a phenomenon as common as it is disturbing. The person who finally decides to declare their feelings and, the day before, invents a fight. The professional who is about to apply for their dream job and mysteriously forgets the deadline. The artist who finishes their masterpiece and keeps it in a drawer for months, creating endless excuses not to show it to the world. The entrepreneur who gives up on the business just when things start to work out. How many times have you had the strange experience of being literally inches away from an achievement and inexplicably backing down? How many times have you started something with genuine enthusiasm, only to abandon it halfway through for reasons you can't even explain clearly? How many times have you looked in the mirror after yet another almost, another "I'll do it tomorrow," another unfinished project, another relationship that ended because of conflicts created out of thin air? And most disconcerting, how many times have you blamed yourself for this dynamic, believing it was laziness, lack of focus, inability, weakness of character? How many hours have you spent tormenting yourself, calling yourself a failure, wondering why other people succeed and you don't? Why does life seem like an endless sequence of missed opportunities and wasted potential? There is a silent epidemic going on inside modern minds. An invisible war is being waged between what one deeply desires to be and a hidden force that operates in the shadows, systematically sabotaging every attempt at growth. This force does not shout. It whispers. It does not attack head-on. It seduces. And the most disturbing thing is that it speaks with one's own inner voice. Carl Jung spent decades studying this phenomenon, which he called the shadow, that forgotten part of the psyche that carries not only repressed fears, but also a primitive logic of survival. A logic that learned, at some lost point in personal history, that growing up is dangerous, that standing out attracts pain, that it is safer to remain small, invisible, mediocre. What most people call personal failure is, in fact, unconscious theater, an elaborate spectacle directed by wounded parts of oneself that believe they are protecting, when in reality they are imprisoning. And the audience for this intimate tragedy is always the same: the consciousness that watches perplexed its own destruction. Jung's most shocking discovery was that this sabotaging force is not a manufacturing defect. It is not a sign of weakness or inadequacy. It is a sophisticated protection system that was built to ensure emotional survival. The problem is that it continues to operate with old data, reacting to threats that no longer exist, protecting a vulnerability that may no longer even be real. But there is something Jung discovered that can completely change this internal dynamic. Something about the real nature of this sabotaging force. Something about why it exists, what it really wants, and how it is possible for the first time in life to stop fighting against yourself and start walking with all parts of yourself integrated. Within every human mind, there is a secret archive, a place where all the experiences that did not fit the idealized image of who one should be are stored. Every moment of rejection, every word of criticism, every episode of shame, every situation in which one felt inadequate, all of this goes into this archive, which Jung called the shadow. But this is not a passive repository of bad memories. It is something much more disturbing. The shadow is a real, living, autonomous psychic system. It observes, it learns, it reacts, and its mission is one: to ensure emotional survival, even if it means destroying the chances of a fulfilling life. Jung discovered that the shadow is formed through a process he called necessary repression. During childhood and adolescence, every human being quickly learns which aspects of their personality are accepted and which must be hidden. The spontaneous child who is constantly silenced learns that their naturalness is dangerous. The sensitive teenager who is ridiculed for their emotions learns that feeling deeply attracts humiliation. The creative young person whose ideas are dismissed learns that expressing themselves is risky. Imagine a child who, every time they showed enthusiasm for something, was ignored or ridiculed. Every time they expressed an idea, they were silenced. Every time they tried to stand out, they were humiliated. That child does not disappear when the body grows up. They become an internal warning system, a voice that whispers, "Don't do that. Remember what happened last time? It's better not to draw attention to yourself." And here is the cruelest aspect of this dynamic. The shadow does not operate with up-to-date data. It is like a computer program running with information from decades ago. For it, you are still 8 years old, still dependent on your parents' approval to survive, still living in that environment where being authentic meant pain. The problem is that this voice continues to operate with the same parameters as decades ago. It cannot distinguish between the past and the present. To it, that vulnerable child is still there, facing the same risks, facing the same threats. And so, it activates its protective mechanisms every time it feels that the safety zone is being threatened. But the shadow is sophisticated in its methods. It doesn't appear shouting, "Stop now." It is much more subtle. It plants seeds of doubt that grow slowly. It creates distractions that seem legitimate. It generates physical symptoms that seem real. The inexplicable procrastination that arises just before an important deadline. The paralyzing anxiety on the eve of a presentation. The sudden urge to create conflict with a loved one just when everything is going well. The sudden desire to give up when you are just a few steps away from your goal. And most insidiously, it does all this using your own inner voice. It does not appear as an external force. It whispers thoughts that seem perfectly rational. Maybe it's not the right time. I should prepare more. This isn't really important. They won't understand anyway. None of this is coincidence. It is the shadow in action, using the language of rationalization to mask primitive fear. It operates through a simple and cruel logic. If we don't try, we can't fail. If we don't expose ourselves, we can't be rejected. If we don't shine, we can't be attacked. It's perfect emotional math, except for one detail. It keeps us prisoners of a life that isn't ours. Jung discovered something even more disturbing about this dynamic. The more you try to suppress the shadow, the more power it gains. The more you fight it, the more creative it becomes in its methods of sabotage. It's like trying to hold down a compressed spring. The accumulated energy eventually explodes in an even more destructive way. People who spend years trying to ignore their inner fears often find that they return with multiplied force at critical moments. The shadow is not evil. It is primitive. It operates on the basis of old emotional impressions, recorded when one was not yet mature enough to process them consciously. It carries the memory of when one was small, helpless, dependent on the approval of others to survive. And that is why it interprets any movement toward autonomy, growth, authenticity as an existential threat. But there is something even deeper going on here. The shadow not only carries the traumas, it also carries the vital energy that was repressed along with them. All the creativity that was silenced, all the courage that was punished, all the spontaneity that was ridiculed, all the personal power that was denied. All of this is imprisoned in this secret archive, like treasures buried in a locked vault. And that is where the key to transformation lies. Because when you understand that the shadow is not an enemy to be defeated, but a wounded part crying out for integration, everything changes. When you realize that this sabotaging force is actually guarding essential aspects of your personality that have been stolen throughout your life, your relationship with it is completely transformed. The internal war can finally turn into dialogue. But for this to happen, one must first understand how this shadow manifests itself in everyday life, what its signs are, its patterns, its most subtle strategies of sabotage. One must learn to recognize its voice among all the other internal voices in order to finally be able to talk to it. There is a particular cruelty in the way the mind betrays itself. There is no fanfare, no declaration of war. Sabotage happens in imperceptible details, in micro moments where a decision dissolves before it is even made. It is like a silent killer who knows all the vulnerable points of his victim intimately. Observe how this manifests itself in real life. The student who spends months planning an important project and in the last week develops an inexplicable compulsion for cleaning. It's not laziness, it's something more sophisticated. It's as if a part of you whispers, the desk needs to be perfectly organized before you start. And when the desk is organized, it's the room. When the room is tidy, it's the computer that needs a thorough cleaning. And so, the deadline approaches while the mind gets lost in rituals of endless preparation. Or the person who finally decides to have a difficult conversation with someone important and mysteriously on the appointed day wakes up with a headache. Not a debilitating migraine that would justify cancelling, just enough discomfort to whisper, maybe it's better to postpone. You're not at your best today. The shadow knows exactly the right dosage of symptoms to create a plausible excuse. Modern self-sabotage is a refined art. It no longer uses crude methods such as dramatic fainting spells or hysterical crises. It has evolved. Now it operates through distractions that seem productive, through symptoms that seem legitimate, through coincidences that seem inevitable. Consider the phenomenon of endless research. How many people spend months preparing to start a project, reading one more book, taking one more course, watching one more tutorial. The shadow whispers, you don't know enough yet. It would be irresponsible to start now. And that voice sounds so rational, so prudent, that it's almost impossible to recognize it as sabotage. There is also sabotage through miscalibrated perfectionism. Not the healthy perfectionism that elevates the quality of work, but the kind that paralyzes you before you even begin. The person who wants to write a book but can't get started because they haven't found the perfect first paragraph yet. As if the universe demanded that every word be born polished. As if there were no such thing as a draft, a process, an evolution. And there is something even more subtle. Sabotage through misdirected altruism. The person who is about to focus on their artistic career but suddenly becomes indispensable in the lives of everyone around them. Everyone seems to need help right now. Everyone has crises that only they can solve. And so their dreams are perpetually on the back burner, always with a noble justification. The shadow knows each person's deepest values intimately and uses those very values to set traps. For someone who values responsibility, it creates endless obligations. For someone who values humility, it whispers about arrogance. For someone who values prudence, it amplifies every imaginary risk. But there is an even more insidious category: sabotage through self-sacrifice. People who develop a compulsion to care for others just when they should be caring for themselves. It's the mother who decides to go back to school and magically all the family crises intensify. It's the professional who's about to change careers and coincidentally everyone around him begins to depend on him financially. The shadow turns generosity into a golden prison. And what about sabotage through excessive analysis? The person who turns every decision into an endless research project. They need to evaluate all possible scenarios, consult all available opinions, weigh all imaginable risks. It's not caution, it's paralysis disguised as prudence. The shadow whispers that more information is always better, that deciding without absolute certainty is irresponsible. There are also those who sabotage through compulsive comparison. Just when they are about to take an important step, they develop an obsession with observing what others are doing. So-and-so's already way ahead. Such and such started younger. That person has more resources. The shadow turns inspiration into discouragement, the reference into anticipated defeat. Perhaps the most devastating mechanism is sabotage through timing. There is always something happening that makes this moment inappropriate. If it's January, it's better to wait until after Carnival. If it's March, maybe it's better to wait until the middle of the year. If it's June, the end of the year would be more appropriate. And when December arrives, January is the perfect time for new beginnings. It's a temporal carousel where it's never really the right time. And here's something few people realize. The intensity of sabotage is directly proportional to the importance of what is being sabotaged. The more significant the step you are about to take, the more creative and persistent the internal resistance becomes. It's as if the shadow has a radar to detect exactly when something really matters. There is also sabotage by anticipation of failure. The mind creates catastrophic scenarios so vivid that they become more real than reality itself. What if I try and fail publicly? What if they find out I don't know what I'm doing? What if I succeed and can't maintain it? These scenarios are not helpful warnings. They are horror movies projected by the shadow to keep everything as it is. If you've stopped to recognize yourself in some of these patterns, it's no coincidence. It's a sign that something in you is ready to see beyond the well-constructed justifications and recognize the invisible threads that have been controlling your choices. Sabotage doesn't happen because you're weak or undisciplined. It happens because there's a war between two versions of yourself, the version that wants to grow and the version that wants to stay safe. And as long as this war remains unconscious, it will continue to be fought through symptoms, through coincidences, through 1,000 small daily betrayals that accumulate into a life of unfulfilled potential. But recognizing the patterns is only the beginning. The real challenge lies in understanding why they exist, where they come from, and why certain specific experiences from the past still echo so strongly in the present, shaping decisions you don't even realize you're making. There is a cruel paradox in human nature. The parts of ourselves that most need to be heard are precisely those we resist listening to the most. For decades, the prevailing approach has been to try to silence, control, or defeat these disruptive inner voices. But Jung proposed something radically different, and for many, deeply uncomfortable. What if instead of fighting the shadow, we sat face to face with it? The idea of dialoguing with the part of yourself that sabotages you may sound crazy. After all, why would anyone give voice to the very thing that is destroying their life? It's like negotiating with your own kidnapper. But Jung discovered something extraordinary. When we completely ignore these parts, they gain total autonomy. When we try to suppress them by force, they grow stronger. But when we finally offer them a conscious space to express themselves, something unexpected happens. They begin to reveal their motives. Jung developed a technique he called active imagination, a process where instead of trying to empty the mind, one consciously immerses oneself in the inner chaos. It is not meditation in the traditional sense. It is a direct encounter with the psychic forces that inhabit the unconscious. It is like descending into the depths of oneself armed only with curiosity and the courage to listen. The process is as simple as it is frightening. In a state of conscious relaxation, you allow images, voices, sensations, or even internal characters to emerge spontaneously. And then, instead of observing them passively, you engage with them actively. You talk to them. You ask questions. You listen to their answers. It is a dialogue with parts of yourself that may never have been allowed to express themselves directly. Initial resistance to this process is always intense. The rational mind protests. This is ridiculous. You're talking to yourself. You're making all this up. But Jung knew that this resistance is itself a symptom. It is the voice of the ego that feels threatened by the possibility of discovering that it is not in complete control of the personality. Imagine sitting down internally face to face with that part of you that procrastinates. Not to judge or correct it, but to genuinely ask, what are you trying to protect me from? The answer may be surprising. Perhaps it reveals that every time you stood out in the past, something painful happened. Perhaps it carries the memory of when you tried to shine and were humiliated. Perhaps it still sees you as that vulnerable child who needed to hide in order to survive. Or consider dialoguing with the part that creates conflict in relationships. Instead of just feeling ashamed of this pattern, what would happen if you asked her, why do you do this? She may reveal that she has learned that it is safer to be abandoned for her imperfections than to be left after showing her true nature. She may be constantly testing whether people will stay when you are not at your best. The experience of establishing this dialogue for the first time can be deeply unsettling. Many people report a strange feeling of talking to someone they know intimately but have never consciously encountered. It's like discovering that there is a tenant in your own home who has always been there, influencing decisions, but who has never been formally introduced. The most shocking aspect of this process is discovering that these sabotaging parts are rarely malicious. They are, for the most part, wounded and outdated versions of yourself that still operate on the logic of emotional survival. They carry unprocessed trauma, ancestral fears, experiences of rejection that were so impactful that they created entire systems of protection. The shadow that sabotages relationships may have learned that intimacy is dangerous. The shadow that sabotages professional success may have registered that visibility attracts attacks. The shadow that sabotages creativity may carry the memory of when authentic expression was ridiculed. All of these parts are trying to protect, even if their methods are completely dysfunctional in the current context. And there is an even deeper discovery in this process. Many of these parts carry not only wounds, but also essential qualities that have been repressed along with the pain. The part that sabotages may be guarding the sensitivity that was ridiculed. The part that hides may be protecting the authenticity that was punished. The part that attacks may be defending the vulnerability that was exploited. But here is the most transformative aspect of this dialogue. When these parts finally feel heard and understood, they begin to collaborate rather than sabotage. It is as if they have spent years screaming for attention through symptoms. And finally, when they receive that attention in a conscious and respectful way, they can stop screaming. Dialogue is not a one-time conversation. It is an ongoing process of integration. Sometimes the inner voices are clear and direct. Other times they communicate through symbolic images, bodily sensations, or emotional memories. What matters is not the form of communication, but the quality of listening. Jung discovered that this process requires a specific skill, the ability to maintain two perspectives simultaneously. On the one hand, to engage seriously with these inner voices as if they were real and legitimate. On the other hand, to remain aware that this is an internal psychological process. It is like being both the actor and the director of your own inner drama. And there is something deeply liberating about discovering that you are not a victim of chaotic forces. You are a complex system of parts that have legitimate motivations, even when expressed in destructive ways. When you stop fighting yourself and begin to understand the internal logic of your own contradictions, a new kind of inner peace becomes possible. But this process of integration requires something that modern society rarely teaches: the ability to tolerate internal ambiguity, the courage to discover that you are more complex than you imagined, the maturity to recognize that your own shadows may contain not only wounds but also emotional treasures that have been buried along with the pain. There is a moment of silence that occurs when two forces that have always been at war finally meet face to face. It is neither the peace of the victors nor the resignation of the defeated. It is something deeper, mutual recognition between parts of yourself that never knew they could coexist. When you establish this genuine dialogue with your shadow, when you listen to its reasons and understand its fears, something extraordinary begins to happen. The energy that was once used to create obstacles, to sabotage, to destroy, slowly begins to reorganize itself. It is as if a river that has always flowed against the main current has finally found a way to flow in the same direction. The transformation does not happen all at once. There is no magical moment where you suddenly stop sabotaging yourself and become a completely different person. The integration is more subtle, more organic. It is like learning a new internal language, where parts that previously communicated through symptoms and sabotage begin to use words, images, conscious sensations. The person who always procrastinated may begin to notice when anxiety arises, and instead of getting lost in distractions, may pause and ask, "What are you afraid of right now?" And perhaps the answer is, "I'm afraid that if I finish this and it's not perfect, they'll judge me like they did before." And then for the first time, there is a conscious choice. One can respond to that part. "I understand your fear. Let's do this together, but let's start anyway." The person who always created conflict in relationships may begin to recognize the pattern the moment it arises. That familiar tension, that urge to argue over nothing. But now, instead of acting on impulse, there is room to ask, "What's going on here? What are we running away from?" And maybe the answer is, we're afraid that he'll abandon us when he finds out who we really are. It's better that he leaves now because of us than later because of our truth. This is the alchemy of integration, transforming the lead of sabotage into the gold of awareness. The energy that once destroyed becomes the same energy that builds. The fear that once paralyzed becomes intelligent caution. The anger that once exploded becomes healthy boundaries. The sadness that once depressed becomes genuine sensitivity. Jung discovered something revolutionary. The darkest aspects of our personality often contain in distorted form our greatest virtues. The part that sabotages relationships may be protecting an extraordinary capacity to love deeply. The part that avoids challenges may be guarding a sensitivity that has been wounded by trying too hard. The part that hides may be protecting an authenticity that the world has not yet learned to value. When these parts are integrated, they do not disappear. They transform. The person remains cautious, but their caution now serves growth, not stagnation. They remain sensitive, but their sensitivity becomes a form of emotional intelligence, not paralysis. They remain protective, but their protection now includes protecting their own potential, not just their wounds. And there is something deeply liberating about realizing that you can finally stop fighting yourself. That the energy you spent trying to suppress unwanted parts can be redirected to create, to build, to evolve. It's like discovering that you've been trying to drive a car with the handbrake on for decades and finally releasing it. But perhaps the most transformative aspect of this integration is the discovery that you are in fact much more complex, rich, and interesting than you imagined. All those parts that were rejected, hidden, fought against carry unique aspects of your personality. When integrated, they don't make you problematic, they make you whole. An integrated person is not one who has no shadow. It is one who knows their shadow, dialogues with it, and can consciously choose when and how to express different aspects of themselves. They are not perfect. They are whole. They are not free of conflict. They are aware of their conflicts. And there is a fundamental difference between the internally divided person and the integrated person. The former lives in constant war with themselves, expending infinite energy on internal battles that no one can win. The latter lives in a complex internal dance, where different parts may have different perspectives but work toward the same goal, an authentic and fulfilling life. Jung knew that this process has no end. Integration is a continuous journey, not a destination. There will always be new layers to explore, new aspects to understand, new dialogues to establish. But there is a fundamental difference between living unconsciously, at the mercy of internal forces that one does not understand, and living consciously, in constant conversation with all parts of oneself. When you reach this point, you realize something that changes everything. You were never really failing. You were always learning. You were never really sabotaging yourself. You were always trying to protect yourself in the only way you knew how. And now finally, you can protect yourself in a way that also allows you to grow. True psychological maturity is not the absence of internal contradictions. It is the ability to embrace these contradictions as part of human richness. It is discovering that you can be both vulnerable and strong, cautious and courageous, protective and expansive. It is realizing that completeness does not come from eliminating parts of yourself, but from integrating them into a complex and beautiful symphony. In the end, Jung teaches us that the greatest act of courage is not to defeat our inner demons. It is to sit down at the table with them and discover that behind each demon there is a part of us that just wanted to be heard, understood, and finally embraced as a legitimate part of who we are. And when that integration happens, when all parts of us finally move in the same direction, we discover something extraordinary. We were much more powerful than we ever imagined, but we were using our power against ourselves. When was the last time you stopped to truly listen to what your inner resistance was trying to tell you? Tell us in the comments. If you've made it this far, you've already taken a step beyond most people. You watch the videos, you reflect on each idea. Now the question is, how far do you want to go with this? If you want to take the next step and truly apply this knowledge to your life, the White Rabbit codes are ready for you. The link is in the pinned comment. Remember, success is a decision. The choice is yours. Count on me and follow the White Rabbit.